Hello, Miss Adventure here, and in today's class, we're going to explore the tenets of critical pedagogy, an approach that has revolutionized my teaching and has given me language to finally speak to the struggles I felt during my 5 years in the classroom. But before we get to the heart of this philosophy, I'm going to walk you through this lesson and its objectives. First, I'll be speaking to my personal journey with how empowering learning can be and how that spirit was quashed during my time teaching by the rigidity of what our school systems have become. If you want to jump right into what critical pedagogy is, this would be the chapter to skip. Don't worry, I won't take offense. But my personal experience as a teacher does reveal just how empowering the critical approach to education can be. Despite those all too familiar oppressive conditions we face today in our schools, the situation is not a hopeless one. Which brings us to the first principle of critical pedagogy, imagining humanization. This is the heartbeat of all critical theory, and one that has changed my entire worldview. It seems so simple, but I think you'll be surprised how powerful this tenet is. Then we'll explore the flip side of the coin, dehumanization. Here's where we really start to divulge from what typical teaching looks like. Every teacher speaks to humanization in their classroom, whether they are intentional about it or not, because our work as educators is rooted in helping students flourish. But we were not taught how to speak to students about those difficult things in the world. Critical pedagogy aims to provide useful and productive language for you to use and pass on to your students so they can be equipped to handle the struggles in life that they will inevitably face in our deeply unjust world. The next step is transforming the world. After you are grounded in humanization and have a clearer understanding of dehumanization, subjects like reading, writing, and math have a new purpose. You won't just be teaching them for teaching's sake. They will be tools for your students to change the world in ways that bring about liberation. Finally, critical pedagogy is not just about teachers learning to imagine the good, identify the bad, and transform the world accordingly. It's about passing those skills on to our students. And as a friendly reminder, everyone is an educator. So even if you aren't a teacher, when you develop a deep understanding of these critical skills, you can help cultivate them in others. Ultimately, this lesson is to teach you that critical pedagogy is about allowing humanity to absolutely flourish. Learning is about freedom, but our current approach to education is not. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited to dive into critical pedagogy so we can begin the process of liberating through learning. Let's go. Gardener of children. The word kindergarten has always delighted me. Invented by the German educator Friedrich Froebel, who recognized that children require attentive nurturing, the concept reimagined school as a garden of children. And as an educator, this evergreen sentiment rings true for me. It may be a term for a grade level I could never teach. Bless you, Miss Duvey, how did you do it? But nevertheless, kindergarten captures the spirit of my approach. I am a gardener, laboring always in the hopes that the life under my care will flourish. But perhaps the reason the metaphor resonates so deeply is because when the day is at an end, I too have my sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose, and a smudge or two on my face. My classroom is my bit of earth, and I long for it to be bursting with growth, where ideas of all colors sprout from buried bulbs, each planted after a gentle brainstorm when the land was still sprinkled in the dewdrops of possibility. Creativity is always in bloom, no matter the season. Students ground themselves in the rich soil of curiosity and end their day with a healthy coating of dirt on their hands. That's the kind of education I want to cultivate for them. The kind that allowed the sprightly young learner I used to be the chance to regularly get her hands dirty. Though, to be honest, the messes I made at school were usually not ones that could be linked to the curriculum for that day. Teachers, Miss Duvey included, often apologized to my mother incessantly at pickup for the shabby state of my appearance. She would always just wave them away and smile at the tousled kid scrambling into the back seat, marker stains up her arms, grass stains down her legs. Mom knew learning involved scuffed up shoes and rumpled dresses, and I'm grateful. Her knowledge allowed me the freedom to really explore what learning was to me. And so, learning became a little escape, a place in my mind where I could always indulge in the sweet joy of discovery. The freedom my mother passed on to me was the key to unlocking the door of a sanctuary of exploration, hidden in the back of my mind behind a curtain of vines that rustled gently in the breezes of my youthful imagination. When the door creaked open, the melody of a red-breasted songbird welcomed me into a world of green, a cool cosmos of creation. It was as if someone had spilled the perfume of springtime at my feet, and it filled my lungs as I stepped into the grove. A lush garden of learning tumbled about before me, and time seemed to disappear as I spent my days playing in the shade of ancient wisdom. Are any of you on to me yet? I have stolen a garden. Or rather, I've been blatantly using imagery and lines from one of those 90s movies that charmed us all, The Secret Garden. I wasn't too far into writing this piece before I realized that if I was going to unearth enough enchantment to articulate what learning meant to me, I needed to immerse myself in the magic of that film's flora and fauna once again. And watching the scenes that had deeply rooted themselves in the imagination of my childhood, Frances Hodgson Burnett captivated me once again with her timeless tale of wonder. And I'm just going to keep dropping obscure references to it until I have people to gush about it with. So do us both a favor, drop everything and just watch it, okay? That way, when you circle back here, you and I will share the same visceral understanding of learning, one that is dripping with Burnett's particular brand of magic. For, as everyone with the universe in their throat knows, learning should cast a spell on you, breathing life back into your spirit. The free exploration in the meadow of my mind taught me that, and I carried that age-old knowledge out into the world as I grew up. Eventually, it became the foundation upon which I began my work as an educator. With every new school year, I found myself standing in the doorway before my little patch of earth with the great aim to replicate the lush garden of my mind in the conditions of this particular classroom. But as every gardener could tell you, no matter how hard you labor and how long you toil, you are never the only factor. The environment of your garden cannot always be completely controlled, nor can it always be overcome. And as every teacher could tell you, although we are laboring harder than ever, we have never had less control of our garden's environment. Outside forces are working to mechanize the natural learning process we have spent years cultivating. They plow through the door, crushing our students' wildflowers and carving up the slopes into endless, emotionless rows, each calculated to produce an exact amount of fruit by a particular deadline. They tinker with the temperature, shut out the sunshine, and demand that every blade of grass be collected, counted, and cataloged. They ignore the songs of the nightingales, muffle the whisper of the lilies, and discount what we gardeners know best. Much of what happens in this little green grotto is magic, pure and incalculable. Yet, even in the faces of those dominating forces, I always began the fall season with an earthy optimism, a belief that this would be the year I could save all those special spaces from the tilling of the tractors. My experience had finally blossomed into expertise, and this would be the year I could use that knowledge to protect the natural wonders of my classroom from the looming darkness of the testing season that lay ahead. The manufactured winter of standardization was coming, and this would be the year that I conquered it. I always spent months in anticipation of this encounter. Usually by January, I was well into my prepping, planning, and printing for the next fall. And once the school year was over, I could really kick into gear. One Texas summer, I became a hot piece of neighborhood gossip. Had that beat-up car been abandoned in the school parking lot? Or has some masochist spent June and July all alone in a building without air conditioning? Pretty perceptive, but not completely accurate. I wasn't alone, thank you very much. My burly bear of a dog could sometimes be found, splayed on the cool tile, lazily keeping his eye on me as I disregarded workplace regulations and the laws of physics themselves to reach my classroom's highest heights. Otherwise, the neighbors were spot on. I was a single gardener in an empty school, sweating before a copier in a futile attempt to beat that school year rush. But it didn't matter how many hours I spent winterizing my classroom. I could never get ahead of the darkness, and the whole neighborhood could vouch that it was not for lack of trying. The frosty fingers of testing season crept through the cracks in the garden wall earlier every year, throttling life from young bulbs and leaving a trail of dead ideas behind them. As the barren months stretched on without sunlight, once fruitful plants withered before my very eyes. The icy chill of standardization kept my foliage in a perpetual state of frostbite. I kept promising that sunshine was coming soon, so soon. But I knew the truth. We would only get a couple weeks in May to celebrate learning in all its bounty and beauty, if we were lucky. After a few years of this crushing cycle, it was clear to me that no life could thrive under such unnatural conditions. My students were certainly not flourishing, and frankly, neither was I. Rolling up my sleeves and laboring harder wasn't working. If I were to play a role in giving students the freedom to unlock a world of botanical wonders of enchanting knowledge, I had to get to the root of these environmental problems. But where could a gardener like me dig up solutions? Turns out, I needed to spend some time in that mossy refuge in my mind to learn a way out again. And now that I'm spending time focused on learning, as an adult this time, I'm beginning not to expect exact answers. Nevertheless, each time I return from my garden of learning, I am abuzz with old knowledge, new language, and a different perspective. I've tried to capture 4 of the most central principles to the magic of critical pedagogy, so take them back under those ancient oaks in your mind. Perhaps this knowledge will give you what it gave me, a little bit of freedom to flourish. Imagining humanization. Critical pedagogy first took shape in Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where, in the first couple pages, an idea with a rhythm and rhyme planted itself in my mind. Humanization is the people's vocation. Humanization is the people's vocation. It's not an exact quote, but it's the heartbeat of critical pedagogy, and it pulses through the rest of the book and all the theories it touches. But what exactly does it mean? Let's reframe it with gardening. Plantization is the plant's vocation. In other words, plants gonna plant. Their whole purpose is to flourish, to bloom to their fullest selves. But a single flower cannot accomplish a state of plantization on its own. When you look at a garden in bloom, it is not made up of lone plants, each on a singular path. It is an overgrown community of vegetation, each individually thriving because they are committed to engaging in the plantization process together. So as far as humanization goes, the garden teaches us 2 lessons. Each of us is meant to experience life in its fullness, and in order to do so, we must cultivate an environment where we can all flourish. Humanization is the people's vocation. Humanization is the people's vocation. When I first put my finger on that heartbeat, I knew it was the closest language I'd ever had to describe the nameless purpose I'd always felt pulsing through my veins, pushing me to be authentic, fueling me with the power to fight for my own freedom. That instinct for humanization manifests itself when a child unconsciously expresses who they are, simply fulfilling their deep-rooted desire to bloom to their fullest humanity. And so, as gardeners of those budding humans, humanization is at the heart of our work. It is our duty to build up those buttercups. For just as every plant knows how to be true to itself, so does every child. We should value and trust their unique humanity and teach them to value and trust it themselves. With humanization as our guide, teachers can give students a strong foundation of self-acceptance, one that is essential for a fruitful life. But this foundational lesson comes with another. As one starts to recognize the inherent worth of their humanity as a matter of simply being alive, one also begins to realize that every other human is equally as worthy, as a matter of simply being alive. This knowledge is at the root of all those community building activities we do to deepen our students' sense of respect and justice. Teachers are engaging in the work of humanization on many fronts, even when they aren't aware of it. Imagine what we can do when we are. Doesn't naming humanization in your life make your heart flower open a bit? Me too. Profound insights like that are kind of Paulo Freire's specialty, and I'll let you know if their magic ever really wears off. By framing liberation as our legacy, he tapped into something that is both intimate and universal at once, something very human. Humanization is a fitting term for that force fueling us ever onward in this quest for liberation, and critical educators are committed to keeping that fight for freedom at the center of their work. In order to be part of this movement, you'll need to reflect on what humanization looks like, perhaps in that hidden hollow of your imagination. In the Critical Pedagogy Primer, scholar Joe Canchillo explains how developing your visionary skills in this way will benefit you in the classroom. With this larger vision in mind, educators are empowered to identify the insidious forces that subvert the success of particular students. This ability is not generally found in typical educational practice. The first step to becoming a critical pedagogue is having this image of freedom in your mind, because, as Canchillo notes, it's what allows us to recognize things in reality that diverge from that great destination of justice. And that recognition leads us to the next step on the road to becoming a humanizing teacher, developing critical sight. Seeing and analyzing dominant power. So, you've leaned on the doorframe and longed for your classroom to be a garden of freedom. Check. Now it's time to begin identifying instances when reality does not meet that standard of liberation, and that begins with a discussion of humanization's counterpart, dehumanization. This dark side of power manifests itself in societal forces that quash any natural outgrowth of humanization. Instead of allowing people to flourish in their freest forms, oppression attempts to rip out expressions of humanity by their roots. A person can be stifled in ways both big and small on the basis of their sex, race, class, language, gender, religion, heritage, ability. The list goes on. And it is one we are quite familiar with, for we would not know our longing for liberation so intimately if it wasn't for our constant struggle against that onslaught of oppression. Those isms are so commonplace that we often forget they are not guaranteed by the laws of nature. The grim reality is that racism, sexism, classism, and all those other isms are man-made. They are manifestations of power, wielded by people and moving through the world in dehumanizing ways. Since individuals can oppress one another by utilizing these power dynamics, those familiar isms can become baked into our society's institutions by people who establish enforceable laws, regulatory guidelines, and even unspoken rules. Understanding how dehumanization is perpetuated by dominating forces moving through the world is central to critical pedagogy. For the sake of a flourishing garden, one must get to the heart of that manufactured winter and the suffering that it causes. Joe Canchillo contends that any educator who wants their vision of liberation to manifest in the real world must gain knowledge of the societal contexts greater than the classroom. To develop a sense of critical sight, you must learn to contrast the image you've cultivated with the good with your awareness of the bad. The more you understand humanization as a concept and construct that vision of freedom in your mind, the more you will be able to see the invisible powers of domination weaving their way into your reality. Your critical sight will allow you to locate the fingerprints of dehumanization and ultimately trace them back to their oppressive source, thanks to your knowledge of injustice. And the classroom garden is the ideal place for teachers to begin cultivating their capacity for critical sight by learning to identify when the life in their care is being crushed under the heel of dehumanization. Kinshillo argues that teachers will learn to see anew, to discern the role of values and power in knowledges originally presented as innocent. With their 3D glasses, teachers who grasp these theoretical constructs can interpret and make meanings around the complex interaction of theory and practice. Critical sight will empower you to take up the highest calling for a gardener of children, to be a conservationist of humanity. Learning to recognize all the different forms of dehumanization is essential, but it is not the only task of a critical educator. Indigenous scholar Sandy Grande notes that understanding dominating power is merely the first of many tasks you must engage in to be part of this great legacy of liberation. Critical pedagogy aims to understand, reveal, and disrupt the mechanisms of oppression imposed by the established order, suturing the processes and aims of education to emancipatory goals. Once you develop an awareness of how repression manifests itself in your classroom, you cannot keep it to yourself. Grande asserts that since the true objectives of education are rooted in human freedom, it becomes the duty of the watchful educator to expose any forces that work against that intent, including those that are perpetuated by the schools themselves. Your allegiance as a critical educator is to liberation itself, not to any system that engages in dehumanizing practices. That's right, my friends. Now you have theoretical grounds to resist the forces of dehumanization in your classroom. This is what I needed when I was a gardener, although I didn't know it. By myself, I had felt oppression moving but couldn't express it. Critical pedagogy gifts me not only with the language to understand and articulate the forces overtaking my garden, but also with the justification that empowers me to take action against them each day. Transforming the world. Inhale that sweet inspiration, drifting in on the breeze. It does not smell of shallow encouragement intended only to comfort but never sustain you. Instead, the air is rich with an earthy scent, one that reminds you there is much work to be done. Sandy Grande taught us that once critical pedagogues have an understanding of the human suffering around them, they must work first to reveal that oppression and then disrupt it. And that feels right, it sounds good, but what does that all look like? Luckily, Paulo Freire has some ideas. He argued that just as humanization is an inherent part of the human experience, so is our perspective as historical beings, creatures who have a natural capacity to discuss their past and present in an attempt to collectively construct their future. Freire believed that when we use the human gift of dialogue to articulate our knowledge with one another, we are participating in the great calling of humanity itself, the call to change the world. Or, in the words of Freire himself, to speak a true word is to transform the world. But surely, this is just a philosophical musing, you say. This could not honestly be a central tenet of a social theory that is rooted in reality. Oh boy, does critical pedagogy have some surprises in store for you, my friend. The first of which will teach you that knowledge grounded in the human experience is as real as it gets. And while Freire's sentiment may come across as a platitude, it is actually speaking to something at the center of what it means to be human. Something very real, yet currently without exact scientific explanation. Language. For while the capacity for language is one of those basic building blocks of human nature, even Noam Chomsky will tell you that scientists still know very little about it. On one hand, much about language is as mysterious as human life itself. Science does not yet have answers to questions like, why is it here? Where did it come from? How did it begin? On the other hand, language is simply another ability, like the sense of sight, one in our body that we just naturally tap into. Chomsky equates our phase of language development to puberty. At a certain stage, the body just kicks into gear to develop naturally. No one teaches us how to see, and no one teaches us how to speak either. Not really. Humans just naturally learn to express themselves through language, long before they ever attend a class on the subject. Through the educational process of human existence, we learn to use the words we have to express ourselves to the fullest degree that we want, all without a syllabus. This is how we use all of our human abilities, to the extent that they are helping us in our endless endeavor to tweak our reality little by little. In that sense, language is just another medium through which humans create change. But Freire specifically chose language as the key to transformation because it unlocks our historical nature. Language provides access to both the lessons of the past and the ideas about the future, allowing us the unique human opportunity to make informed choices in the present. The potential for creating revolutionary change that is inherent in language can be harnessed through dialogue, one of the most powerful resources in the critical educator's toolkit. But dialogue is so much more than just a method for managing one's classroom effectively. It becomes a kind of lifestyle, an approach to others that engages them in meaningful conversations so as to both strengthen one's mission of liberation and clarify it. Dialogue strengthens your pursuit of humanization because it gives you the chance to widen your perspective on the human experience. Your recognition of your inherent worth as a human on a quest for freedom gives you the confidence to share your opinion with others. But it also reminds you that this is a collective quest, and the only way to gain humanization is to acquire it together. You need to share what you know and learn what you don't, and I can think of no better way than through conversation. The only way dialogue can cultivate the fruits of true freedom is if you enter this shared space of language with confidence and humility, a unique balance we as conversational creatures were destined to hold. Informed by your critical understanding of humanization, you can be secure that the human force alive within you is worthy, individual, and just trying to bloom like everyone else's. This awareness should ground you in the same equally deserving place as the rest of us, but with your own singular set of intelligences, abilities, and perspectives to bring to our collective goal of blossoming. You and all you have to offer are part of a great legacy, so speak up for freedom's sake. But you must not become overconfident and forget that fundamental humility piece. Listening is just as essential to human nature as speaking. We each have chosen to cultivate certain types of intelligences, and for all the knowledge you have, there is so much more you don't. And that's okay. It's just the human condition. So open yourself up and be humbled by all the botanical wonders grown from the rich knowledge of the people around you. Dialogue also offers a unique opportunity to take the budding ideas from the garden of your imagination and bring them out into the sunshine. As you step out of your mind and cross the threshold into reality, in this new light, it is often difficult to unearth the correct words to communicate your thoughts to others. Only through dialogue can you continue to attune the fruits of your imagination to the real-world environment by allowing others to help clarify your homegrown truths. Their outside perspective may provide just the nourishment your thoughts needed to flourish in a completely new way, and you'll find yourself being enriched by an ever-expanding world of human ideas. Keep that up, and the little green grotto in your mind will soon be bursting with life. But all that potential for transformation is not meant to be contained behind the door of your imagination for long. It's waiting for you to turn that doorknob and take action. Dialogue is one of human nature's greatest mechanisms, a kind of conversational collider. Massive amounts of language streams through its machinery, each word saturated with atoms of potential transformation. Designed to cause those particles to collide, dialogue plays a major role in sparking kinetic change in the real world. Paulo Freire maintained that only by sparking language's aptitude for action can dialogue be used for its purpose in the pursuit of humanization. When a word is deprived of its dimension of action, reflection automatically suffers as well, and the word is changed into idle chatter. It becomes an empty word, one which cannot denounce the world, for denunciation is impossible without a commitment to transform, and there is no transformation without action. All meaningful conversations are linked to actions that matter, actions that transform the world. But how can you know which actions to take? Freire is not going to offer you exact answers on where to go next, simply because he trusts that engaging in true dialogue will lead you to them. In its most authentic form, dialogue will discuss the present condition with the aim of changing that current reality in ways both big and small. If this is not the aim of the conversation, the people involved are disconnecting from their humanity. Dialogue will be most effective when all parties are working from a vision of humanization and utilizing their sense of critical sight. With a deep Freirean trust in the people, including yourself, you can feel secure that no matter how effective the chosen action turns out to be, if it was democratic, then it was true. True because it was a manifestation of genuine human instinct toward freedom, an authentic engagement in our great legacy of liberation. If you use dialogue for its natural purpose of transformation, humanity will bloom wherever you step. You will discover truly meaningful ways to use your time, to use your space, to use your life. And while everyone's contribution matters in this democratic pursuit of humanization, educators occupy a unique space in the movement, and it gives them the power to transform the world in a revolutionary way. You have the great opportunity to take the fruits of your labor as a critical pedagogue, your cultivated senses of imagination, sight, and transformation, and share them with your students. The freedom you offer them may be the key to the greatest possible discovery they could come across in the green grotto of their mind: true human liberation. Cultivating critical ability in others. Education is one of the most powerful ways to transform the world. I know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but the fact that teaching is largely overlooked and undervalued in the modern world just goes to show how many people still need to understand its true worth. We've got some teaching to do about teaching, y'all. Because of course, not only do we engage in the fundamental work of helping young people develop their sense of self-worth and spirit of cooperation, we also cultivate in them the other necessary skills to live a life of meaning in our society. We are shaping generations of young lives as they are developing their consciousness in this world. The importance of our great responsibility should not be understated, yet we are surrounded by a discourse that downplays the work of teachers constantly. Critical pedagogues argue this is because every institution with the power to create and sustain discourse on a great scale has people at the top benefiting from the current conditions of reality. People who do not want transformation to be a real option. But transforming the present to make room for more freedom is simply what humans do, and any attempt to suppress that instinct for liberation is oppression, plain and simple. In the way we have our society organized, education is a powerful institution like any other, with people at the top benefiting from its current state. And according to critical theorists, the current state of education is not aligned with learning's true purpose of humanization. In their present form, schools are not moving us towards a future of greater freedom. If schools truly had a trajectory toward liberty, they would equip students for adult life with subjects like reading and science, but also with what lies at the heart of the human experience: the senses of imagination, sight, and transformation. The ability to construct a vision of humanization, to see the invisible movements of power streaming around us, to dialogue meaningfully with one another, and to transform the world little by little towards a future of freedom, these are the skills we want to pass on to the next generation. It is their birthright as human beings. We were born to engage each one of those amazing capacities within us. We've just forgotten how. As Paulo Freire reminds us, if ideas are not in the language, in the discourse of a people, they are not being acted upon or maintained. Our natural human abilities to critically imagine, see the invisible, and transform the world are lost traditions. But education can be the institution that restores the lost parts of humanity to our community. Schools can be where Freire's vision of humanization takes root, and critical pedagogy can be our compass, for it points us always towards emancipation. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that oppression will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade. By giving students the opportunity in your classroom to contrast the oppression they face in their daily lives with the vision of humanization they work to cultivate, Freire argues that you will spark dialogue and other manifestations of action that will bring us all one step closer to freedom. So, how will the critical values of imagination, sight, and transformation grow in your classroom garden? In what ways can you cultivate your students' sense of identity and show them how to value one another on a deep human level? When can you squeeze in some room for simply imagining? How can you incorporate true dialogue into your unique teaching approach? What connections can you make between the curriculum and the lives of your students? And what frameworks can you offer them to make sense of their world? All those questions lead us to our greatest challenge as educators. How can we teach our students to use all their knowledge and abilities to create a world in which they can all flourish? People will try and tell you that all this Freirean talk of revolution and liberation is fanatical, but it just isn't. History tells us so. Like every human being before him, Paulo Freire longed to change and revolutionize the world he knew, just like every human since. Revolution isn't new or extremist. It's just the human condition to transform in action, something that becomes more clear the more you study lessons from history. What is considered radical by many today was just an expected part of the fight for freedom in the past, but those facts are often, rather conveniently, left out of the discourse. If you consider it radical to work towards further human liberation, then you must acknowledge the radical roots of the United States, founded by a people struggling for their freedom and equality. If critical pedagogy and its ideas are radical, then so is the great American philosopher at the top of every syllabus of each education course in the country, John Dewey. Considered to be a critical pedagogue, even though he was born a century before the movement was founded, Dewey was one of the greatest philosophers during the 20th century. His approach was founded on the belief that democracy was more than just a form of government. It was an entire way of life, one with liberation at the center. According to Dewey, it was the job of education to sustain this nucleus of liberty. Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. The vision of humanization he imagined and worked towards was one where free human beings associated with one another on terms of equality. Dewey knew in order for that image of liberation to manifest in real life, society must be organized around democracy. Only when the power of the government is in the hands of all the people can it be wielded to build that ideal world of equality. Not only must educators believe that this far-off vision is possible, but according to Dewey, we must actually prioritize the realization of this vision by advancing the ideals of equality and freedom in our classrooms. The ideal may seem remote of execution, but the democratic ideal of education is a farcical yet tragic delusion, except as the ideal more and more dominates our public system of education. It is your job as an educator to push the bounds of freedom in your classroom toward a world of further liberation. Do not be discouraged when you are told that your vision is too far-fetched, too idealistic, or too radical. John Dewey would just say that means you're doing something right. But he'd also remind you to follow the tenets of critical pedagogy and allow that ideal to blossom from your imagination and actually manifest in your classroom. The rebirth of democracy in this generation, like all the generations before it, will require action be taken. Domination is not dismantled otherwise. So do not hold on to your vision of the good merely to comfort yourself. Let it spur you onwards toward authentic action and true transformation, toward a revolution of humanization. Even though he wrote in the 1920s, long after the Revolutionary War had been won, John Dewey knew that revolution in this country was far from over, for this was not yet the land of equal opportunity from his vision. And since we find ourselves reaching that same conclusion today, we must identify the forces of dehumanization keeping us from that ideal and revolutionize the systems they hide within. Dewey believed that education was at the heart of this humanizing uprising, saying, "Any genuine teaching will result, if successful, in someone's knowing how to bring about a better condition of things that existed earlier." This is what it means to be an educator. Imagine what a better condition looks like, identify what does not match that condition, transform that condition into a better one. Do all this in dialogue with your community and teach your students to do the same. This type of critical education will provide your students not only with the freedom to explore that world of learning in their imaginations, but also the cultivation to wield their unique abilities to manifest the botanical wonders from their minds in ways that humanize the world. As you work to protect your classroom garden from the forces of dehumanization that have not permitted you and your students the freedom to flourish, you will learn techniques for life that you can pass on to those young learners. This is the educational process of their birthright, for every human is destined to join in this great legacy of learning. Viewing education in this way, as a purely human manifestation with a distinct human purpose, is what critical pedagogy wants you to do, not just with schools, but with every aspect of our society. Now is the time to restore our institutions to their most humane form, so that only the meaningful remains. This revolution of restoration must begin with education, which means it starts in our classrooms. The ideas blossoming in the minds of today will be the ones springing up at our feet in the world tomorrow. The world is ours to cultivate with all kinds of humanizing flora and fauna, but we need to learn how. Through critical pedagogy, humanity can bloom. That's all for today, class. Your homework? Watch The Secret Garden, the one from the 90s. I was serious about that. I'll see you next time.